will you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Bruce, who's going to be talking about physical space and territoriality in interpersonal situations. So if you unmute yourself and give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Okay, so shall I begin?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I just want to say to begin with that I saw the singer in the last song. His name is Benny King, and I used to go to the Apollo Theater in Harlem, and I caught his act a couple of times. So that song is one of my favorites of all time. So I'm sort of discombobulated to have to follow a song like that and sing it like this. So, okay. So my talk is on territories. There's a field in psychology that not many people know of. It's called environmental psychology. And it's principally about the use of physical space in how physical space affects people psychologically. So the person I'm going to be talking about, his name is Irving, Irvin Altman, Altman. Altman was a wonderful social psychologist who became interested in environmental psychology, and he wrote a rather boring title of a book, but the book is actually very, very powerful and colorful. The book is called Environment and Social Behavior. The subtitle is much more interesting. It's called Privacy, Personal Space, Territory, and Crowding. So what I'm going to do is talk about the third one, territory. The other thing I just want to say about Altman, if you're interested in my talk, I'm always happy to talk about this. You know, we can talk on Facebook about it or something. But Altman was a very interesting guy. For about 10 years, he edited various topics within environmental psychology, and he got special writers to write for him. So there's one book that he edited called Place Attachment, which is, you know, people getting attached to places. He also co-authored a book called Women and Places, you know, differences between men and women and how they are in place. He did a book on home environments, one on work environments, and one on neighborhoods. So he's had a very interesting and unusual career. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you a couple of questions, and these questions are not anything you can do within the time of the space we have, but they're things for you to think about. The two questions are, how well or badly does your home or work environment conform to optimal territoriality? So how well or badly does your home or work environment conform to optimal territoriality? So my talk will be about optimal territoriality. So I'll give you a lot of structure, and then, you know, if you wanted to, you could look around, look at your house, look at your work environments and say, how much of these optimal territories do I have operating and what's missing? The second question is, how are power struggles in relationships expressed through the control of territories in a home? So in other words, a good way to find out who's got more power in a relationship is look at the territorial distribution throughout the home. You know, you can measure it really in volume. How much space does each person have? So these are, you know, in teaching a course on this, which I just finished, there's lots of writing exercises you can do to make this territoriality stuff practical. All I can give you is sort of the structure of it. But, you know, we'd have to work together over time for you to see how it actually works. But so let me begin. the first thing I want to do is to define what territory is, okay? So please, if you're writing, if I'm going too fast, just stop me and I'll be glad to slow down. So the definition of territory, we're not talking about regions of the country. We're not talking about nation states. We're talking about micro social relationships and interpersonal relationships. Okay, so this is small territory. So our definition is territory is the identification of a geographical area in a way that indicates proprietorship and defense. So the definition is the identification of a geographical area in a way that indicates two things: proprietorship and defense. The reason we have these things are they help to coordinate activities, and coordinating activities to do a number of things. One is to regulate density. The second is to sustain the group over time. The third is to provide hiding places or staging areas for work, for courtship, for nesting, and for feeding. Okay, so second sentence is these territories help to coordinate activities in the following: regulate density, sustain the group over time, provide hiding places or staging areas for work, courtship, nesting, and feeding. So I think you can tell from the end of this that territories are not unique to human beings. Other animals have territories, right? His book talks about the differences between animal and human territories, but we're just going to focus on human beings. Okay, so what I usually like to do is I start out with very clean definitions of things, as if things fit neatly into boxes, just so we have some structure. But after I do that, we'll sort of look at exceptions to the rules and the conditions under which it breaks down. So you just got to be patient for me to set this up, and then we'll talk about exceptions to the rule. So Altman's identified three kinds of territories: primary territory, secondary territory, and public territory. So what primary territory means is it's the exclusive domain of the owner. Okay, the exclusive domain of the owner. The degree of control in primary territory is very high. That means the person will control access and will defend the area against others if necessary. Okay? So the degree of control is high. A person will control density and will defend per se. And as you'll see, some of the other territories will not do that. Another aspect of primary territory is how long a period of time does the person with the territory have? In primary territory, there's a long duration of time. The person in primary territory claims it for a long time, and they will fight to defend it. If we look at a house can be defined as primary, secondary, public territory. An example in a house would be a person's bedroom, right? I mean, that's something that is special. It's out of the way. You don't want people coming into it unless you have some kind of intimate relationship with them. Okay, so There's lots of examples, probably at work. If you're lucky enough to have your own desk, that would probably be primary territory for you. So let me go into what you're going to see is when I go into the other kinds of territories, you'll see that there's primary territory is the most intense. The secondary and public territory are more low key. So secondary territory, our definition of it is no ownership, but it's used on a regular basis. No ownership, but used on a regular basis. The degree of control in secondary territory is moderate. Sometimes a person will leave markers just to hold the territory. I mean, like in the old days, if you went to a library and you went up and you wanted to get a book or something, you'd leave something on the table that would indicate somebody's sitting here. Maybe you would leave a sweater or a coat or something to just indicate this is taken, right? So in secondary territory, others can use the space, but it might need to be negotiated. So, for example, I think you can probably remember this, or maybe it still happens to you. If I would go to a library to get a book, and I'd be sitting at a table, and let's say the table had 4 people sitting at it. If I was the first person there, and I was studying, and then somebody else came to sit there, there's a very interesting thing that happens, which is you want to look the person over and see, okay, does this person seem safe or whatever? But you also want to indicate that it's okay to be there. So there's a kind of like sort of negotiation of nonverbal communication about negotiating. This person has a right to sit here too. It's secondary space. So, but there's no question that people look each other over in secondary space, and it's a kind of thing that people feel like, if I'm here first, I'm sort of defining the terrain here. The duration of the claim on secondary territory is temporary, but it's recurrent. So there's some easy examples of this, and there's funny examples of this. Like you go to a restaurant and you have like a favorite table. Technically, the table is not yours unless you try to reserve it or something. But when you go in, you like to get to that table. That would be your preference. But you cannot stop other people from getting there first. Another example of this is a seat in a classroom. This is always a funny thing for me because I point this out in my classes. Technically, if you're a student and you go into a room and it's got 25 people in it, for the first week or two, the students and everybody agrees that anybody can sit in any seat, right? Anybody is entitled to sit in any seat. But if somebody picks a seat in week 1, they come back to week 2 and they come back to the same seat. By the 3rd week, somehow this person begins to feel like this is their seat. And if somebody comes along and sits in their seat, what they think is their seat, it's uncomfortable. And depending on how long it goes, people become increasingly attached to that secondary piece of space. And also, I just want to point out that people are very attached, much more attached to physical places than you would imagine. I've often said to people in a classroom, look, I would be devil's advocate, and I'd say, I want to prove to you that you're not attached to these seats. You can sit anywhere you want. And in fact, I would give extra credit to people when I'd be doing this class if they were willing to sit in a different seat every week for 18 weeks, okay? Nobody ever got extra credit. People become attached to where they sit. And it's a big thing if I could get a person to move 4 or 5 times over 18 weeks, because people get attached to where they sit. Where you sit has a certain element of predictability to it, right? And people sit in the same places for lots of reasons, right? I mean, when I was a student, I was not a good student. And so I was always sit by the door, so I'd be ready to bolt in a moment, Other people sit in the back for different reasons. People sit in the front for different reasons. Regardless of their reasons, what's most typical is people will come back to where they were over and over and over again. Another example of this, a secondary space, which is funny, is a regular parking place. I remember there's one guy who, at one school I taught at, he had a pickup truck. And he'd always be there. He was a teacher, he had an early class. He was there at 7 o'clock in the morning, And it didn't matter that his parking place was really far away from where the classrooms were. For whatever reasons, he was attached to that area, to that place. And I remember one time when I got there, his space was open, And I thought, do I want to mess with this guy and park in his space and see what happens, right? But I didn't. But I mean, this is an example of this. We were dating, and she owned the house, and I was renting a place someplace else. When I'd go there, we'd be in the living room, and she'd look out the window and she'd say, damn, they took my parking space right in front of the house, right? Being a renter, I just said, what's the big thing? It's a public space. People can park where they want, okay? That was as a renter, right? Then I moved in and we lived there together. And what I noticed is after about 6 months to a year, I started thinking about the space in front of our house as our space, my space, and I began to also get rather insulted when somebody would park there, right? So, okay, so let's go to the third type of territory, public territory. Now, public territory, the definition for this is there's no ownership. It's not used on a regular basis. The degree of control in a public space is low. It means that there's no expectation of future use. And people may resist intrusion only when they're present. The duration of a claim on public territory is temporary and it's irregular. A good example of public territory is a street corner. Have people hang out on the street corner. Going to the beach. The beach is a classic example of public territory. It's interesting, that we have these sort of unspoken ground rules about, say, the beach. Like, you go to a public beach, you put your blanket down. We have certain rules about how far somebody can be when they're next to us. And It's very similar to like being a seat on a train. You know, if you go into like, for example, our train in the Bay Area was BART, and you know, if you went on an empty car and you sat there, you would have certain expectations about how far other people can be before you begin to get uncomfortable. And it's very interesting because, you know, if you everything depends on the situation. So for example, if I'm going to work and everybody else is going to work and the train is packed, people have an understanding that because the train is so crowded, it's okay for people to be right next to each other, you know, just like almost skin to skin or even more. But that does not hold if, for example, one major stop in the BART station was MacArthur Boulevard, which is like a major transfer point. So everybody be on top of each other, but you know that by the time you got to MacArthur, things were going to loosen up. So the ground rules about how close people should be change when the situation changes. So when half the people empty out of the train at the MacArthur station, there's an expectation that people will spread out on the train and not continue to lean on somebody. So if I'm leaning over somebody, it's okay. But then when people get off the train, I cannot stay leaned over a person with a train that's half full. It means a completely different thing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about exceptions to the rules of these things. When one of the places that I used to teach at was a prison. I taught at a prison called Camp Parks. It was in the East Bay of in Pleasanton, I think it was. And I taught a class in environmental psychology to the prisoners. And I asked them what their primary territory was. Their primary territory, they didn't have their own room. They had bunk beds. So their primary territory was the top of their bed. That's what nobody could mess with, right? Another thing that happened is another time I was teaching at the prison. When I left, these were the days when I left teaching. It was about 9 o'clock, and they still had phone booths. Okay, so I go to the phone booth to call Barbara and say, "Okay, I'm done. I'm coming home." And I'm watching, and then she starts asking me, "How is the class?" Blah blah blah. But I'm watching the people around me, the prisoners, and the prisoners are watching what I'm doing. And the longer I stay on the phone, the more uncomfortable they seem to get. So I was uncomfortable enough to where I said, you know, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm just going to get off the phone and leave. So I left the prison, but I came back the following week, and I said to them, I told them what happened, and I said, what was going on here, right? And one of the things they told me was that phone for them is a form of primary territory. I'm relating to the phone using Altman's definition as the phone is kind of like public territory. I'm going into a phone booth and using it. For them, that was primary territory. The reason it was primary territory was that was the link for them with the outside world. And so it was very important to them that whoever was on that phone was not on the phone very long, because they all had their term and they had all their work to be done. I mean, their conversations were probably lined up. So what I'm trying to express to you as we go along here is that not everybody agrees on what's primary, secondary, and public territory. In the best of all possible worlds, people would agree. But most people don't know about these three types of territories. But people sort of, without even knowing it theoretically, people do organize themselves into something like this. But they don't always agree on what's what. So, for example, if you look at a house, usually in a house, the living room is like public territory, right? It means that you can bring in strangers into it comfortably. Chances are, like, now, of course, this dates me, but like there was a time when people would knock on the door and say, my car broke down, can I use your phone, right? And you actually let the person in. But where we would let them in would be, we try to get them into the living room, and it was awkward if the phone was in like a secondary space or the kitchen, because there's a degree of intimacy that you might not want to share with them. So in a house, the most predictable public territory is a living room. Usually a dining room, a kitchen, these are usually secondary territories. They're recurrent, right? There's not proprietorship, ownership of it, except that people can be very territorial about the kitchen. So for maybe a couple of members in the house, the kitchen is secondary territory. For somebody else, it may be primary territory. And so the fighting may go on over what kind of territory this is. Is it primary? Is it secondary? Same thing with the bathroom. Bathrooms are usually considered, generally speaking, to be secondary territory. People use it, they leave, people don't have control. But as we all know, there are some people that treat the bathroom like it's primary territory, right? And so people get into fights over long showers, people kind of holding court in the bathroom. Then within the house, as I mentioned before, primary territory would be people's bedrooms, and kids and parents will often fight over this, because if you're a teenager and you're lucky enough to have your own room, it's supposed to be your primary territory. But then sometimes your parents come in and snoop around, and you wind up having these fights because you feel like this is my territory. They might not have the vocabulary for it, but that's really what's going on. So a lot of this is going back to my question that I asked at the beginning. A lot of the troubles that people have, say, in relationships, whether it's at home or work, center around misunderstandings about territories or disagreements about what the territories are supposed to be used for. Another example, people go into a public area, and they're on a city street. They think the street corner is public, but if you're homeless, it's not public. It's a secondary territory. It's a place where, like some streets, you probably know this from being in Seattle. There are some street corners that are very important to homeless people because they're good places to panhandle. Because, for example, the light is long, and if the light's long, people aren't going anywhere. You have a chance. And so I've seen homeless people get into fights over street corners about who was there first, because they're going to be there for a good portion of the day. So the idea is that these primary, secondary, and public territories that Altman discovered are also sources of power struggle and tension points because there's confusion over how it's being used and why it's being used. Okay, so what I want to leave you with is there are three types of encroachments into territories. The first type of encroachment is a violation. So a violation is the unwanted use of another territory. So there's an expectation on a train that everybody gets one seat. Sometimes people take up two seats. Sometimes people take up, have one seat and then they put their stuff on a second seat. So there's tension between the person sitting down with their over two and then people that are standing. Expectation that people should move their stuff or do something like that. That would be a violation. Another kind of violation would be at work. If somebody comes into your workspace or cubicle when you're on vacation, that can be a violation. I think, as you know, people feel like most people get attached to that place. They put pictures of their family up around the desk or something. They have it in a particular order. And then somebody, say, if you're on vacation, they come into your cubicle to use the space to make phone calls or this or that. And then let's say something innocuous happens, right? Like they inadvertently knock one of the pictures down. Not that it falls on the floor, but just that it sort of moves off its space. And then they try to put it back where it was, but it's really not in the same place. They don't remember. Well, guess who does remember? The person that comes back from work. They come back and they see it's been moved, and people get pushed out of shape about it, right? I mean, it's not just territories. This is not just about people being physical. People become attached to the arrangements of the things on the table. So, I mean, you know, if you think about this, you go, you live in a house, like, so let's say it's not a relationship, you're just like living communally, and you go on vacation for a week, and a couple of your roommates decide they're going to move stuff around, and then they do something, say in the living room, and they move a bunch of stuff around, and you come back. Many people, my guess is most people would be upset that they were not included in the process of where these things are going. Okay, so let me cover the last two types of encroachments, okay? The second is more severe. The second kind of encroachment is called an invasion. An invasion is turning the use of a room or an area into another use, okay? So the difference between a violation and an invasion is a violation keeps the use of the space the same. It's just that they move something around. An invasion is where you actually change the room and what it's used for. So a good example of that is, and of course this is kind of, well, I'll just give you the example. You lived in a house with your parents, right? And then you move out. And then a year, 18 months down the road, you come back and you discover that this room has been turned into a computer room or some other kind of thing. Sometimes people get upset because they feel like they have been upstaged, that room is not theirs. oh, if you're here to visit, you got to sleep in this not your room anymore. For some people, that's an invasion. Of course, the parents may say, look, you're out. I'm going to move things around. So, but that can lead to hurt feelings. The last kind of encroachment is called contamination. Contamination is defiling another person's territory by what's left behind. So the best place to look for this is, think about a time you broke up and one of you moved out and the breakup was kind of nasty. They might leave a couple of torn up photos of you and them on the floor on their way out. This is nasty stuff. This is where people really get in your face. So I think that's as much as I want to say. There's a lot more to this, but I think we've covered this in about a half an hour. So again, if you want to talk to me more about this or got some exercises you might be interested in doing around your own territory, just private message me on the private message page of Facebook, and we can talk about this. Okay, so thanks for listening. It's always a blast to give you guys a talk. Done.
Thanks, Bruce. Can everyone please unmute your, yes, and give a round of applause. Thank you.